today's topics. We're going to be talking about speech-language umbrella, how speech and language skills fit together, a lot of language development and practical strategies on how you can use it, how children articulate, and then also common speech phrases to process early errors in early development. So we're going to be going through all of that. And again, we're so lucky to have Jennifer Katz with us. She is a speech and language pathologist. She is actually just nearby in the Laguna Honda location.
Hi, everybody. Hillary, thanks so much for inviting me. As Hillary said, actually, Hillary, do you want to go ahead and start sharing the presentation?
Yep.
And
pulling that up.
Sorry, Hillary and I was having a little, and if you want to give a scroll, Hillary's just helping me scroll because I was having some computer sharing issues. So if you want to go to the next one. I'll tell you a little bit about me. I want to talk about what does fall under the umbrella of a speech language pathologist. I'm going to go through language norms. What are the expectations with expressive language and receptive language? I'm going to talk briefly about overall speech intelligibility and how we look at that in terms of phonological process errors, and I'll get into what that means versus articulation. I see that I forgot to update my outline as I was updating the content, but I'm going to, after language facilitation, talk a little bit about feeding. I also see there are some feeding questions, and I would also be remiss to not comment on stuttering and fluency as well. So I'm going to try to squeeze all of that in, and yeah, I'll do my best. If you want to slide. So I did see just a little bit about me. I've been practicing for 30 years. I have 2 offices here in San Francisco, and my kind of area of expertise is in oral motor and feeding. So some of those questions, I could talk for hours and days on feeding development and what is the difference between a picky eater and a problem eater, and thumb sucking and open mouth breathing and all of that oral motor stuff. So we're not going to go so deep into that today, but if my email and everything will be at the end, and I would encourage anyone to reach out with any questions that you feel like, oh, that might be my kiddo, or I'd love to know a little bit more about that. I love educating parents and caregivers, so don't hesitate to reach out. All right, you can. So what's under the speech language umbrella? We're going to look at language, expressive language. That's the output. That's the vocabulary. That's the length of the sentence. That is how the child is using language to communicate. Receptive language is the comprehension piece. We can't output language until we can input language. So a child in theory would be able to identify, a horse before they can say horse. So first it comes in before it can go out. And then pragmatic language, that's using language socially. So our hellos, goodbyes, our just able to repair communication breakdowns, the back and forth. So for some children, and we see this in autistic children, they have an amazing expressive vocabulary, but we have breakdowns in the pragmatic and the social language use. Speech intelligibility, the clarity of our speech, is broken down into 2 areas: the phonological process errors, which we'll get into, and the articulation errors. Fluency and stuttering, feeding, oral motor, drooling, thumb sucking, mouth breathing. That's my favorite. I mean, it's all sort of my favorite, but that's my area. And then voice and pre-literacy and literacy. So all of these things fall under the umbrella of speech and language. Okay, Hillary. So I'm just going to go through some of these milestones. And I think the most important thing to say is that you see there's a range here. And even within that range, there's a range. So, I never want a parent to read this and see kind of one sentence and think, oh my gosh, my child is missing this one thing, or my child isn't doing this. It is a holistic picture that we look at the child, and there is such a range of normal and typical and yeah. So these are all meant to be kind of guidelines, and not doing one of these alone is certainly not indicative of anything, really. It's just something to note, and they're general guidelines. So here, in that 1 year to 1.5, they're just starting, single words. And are there some 18-month-olds who are speaking in sentences? Sure. But that doesn't necessarily mean your child is atypical if they're not that child. Maybe your child is doing other things that the other, advanced speaker isn't doing. But really, single words right around a year. They're still using a lot of gestures at this point. We don't really I don't have any grammar expectations. They'll respond to their name, but they're not answering any kind of what or where or who questions at this point. And they're starting, as they hit 18 months, to understand some basic routines and the prepositions of in and on. Put this on your head, put this in the bucket. Can scroll, Hillary, please. 18 to 24 months. 18 to 24 months is kind of the first kind of language explosion, if you will. So if I get a call from a family whose kiddo is, say, 16 months and feels sort of borderline, I might say to the family, like, let's see if we can take that wait and see approach for a couple of months, because we will often, this is a real language explosion. There's 2 big language explosion times, but this being the first one. And here they're imitating consistently. They're using 2 words together. They're using language for different reasons. And they're starting to be able to they're not asking what and where questions, but they're answering, like, oh, what are you sitting on? Or what are you drinking from? And they're now not just following directions with in and on, but they're using these prepositions independently during this time. And we're starting to see some grammatical markers appear around this time. So the 18 to 24 months. 24 to 30, looking at about 3-word phrases, you'll start to hear a lot of the no, blank, and this is where we start to see a lot of the grammatical markers come in. We'll start to get plurals, we'll start to get possessives, we'll start to, it's not on here, but some early pronouns, me, mine. So this little 6-month window, we really start to see some of the shaping with grammar. And now they're starting to ask the what questions and maybe where questions, and developing some of the prepositions now with under and out. And following just a little bit longer directions as well. So this is the second kind of burst of language. So for me, if I have a kiddo who is just after 36 months or after about 3, and the parents call and feel like, oh, I'm just not sure if my kiddo could use some support. If it's after 36 months, I'm usually more inclined to say, let's get our eyes on him or her, because they've gone through kind of those 2 big bursts. That's not to say that other language, of course, still isn't developing, but for me, it's usually that right around that 3-year-old marker, where if we were going to see a spontaneous big push, we usually would have seen it. And I believe in the chat, someone had asked about bilingual language, and it does look a little bit different with bilingual children, and I will speak to that as we get going, or as we continue as well. But here they're able to follow longer directions, their sentence length is increasing, and their language is one of those things where you might look at them and go, oh my gosh, I didn't even know you knew that word, or they're just really talking, they're conversing with you at this point. Okay. Continuing now, we're into the how and why questions. There's a developmental progression of what questions. So first we expect it goes what, where, who, when, why. So it's right around closer to 4 where we start to get some of those why and how questions. So why do birds have wings? It's that like inferential, because. So we're starting to get into a little bit more of that complex language as they hit that 4-year-old age. And their sentences at this point should be, 4, 5, 6 plus words. And then beyond at this point, they're explaining how things work. They're telling stories. Their grammar at this point, with the exception of irregular verbs and irregulars, should be intact. Irregular nouns, irregular verbs, that's closer to even like age 5 to 6, but right around age 5 is when we would expect no grammatical errors. They're answering all and asking all of the who, what, when, where, why questions. They're following directions with prepositions, and they're able to explain things and tell you things that happened that aren't right in front of them. So they'll be able to report back on something that they did at school. So you start to get that kind of reference to things that happen that aren't right in front of them. It's a really fun age for language. Okay. So that's language in a nutshell. I'm going to keep going if that's all right with any clarifications with that piece. No, okay. So speech intelligibility, speech clarity is broken into 2 sections, is broken into 2 columns. One is called phonological patterns or phonological processing errors. And these affect entire groups of sounds, not just one. They're predictable and they follow patterns. And with the exception of 1 or 2, they're all considered developmentally appropriate. And it's really your child taking the path of least resistance when they're learning to speak. And I'll go through the developmental norms of when we would no longer expect them. But to give you an example, like banana, most children, when they're starting to speak, they'll say nana. That is a phonological process error called weak syllable deletion. They left off one of the syllables. Like computer, they might say pewter, or television would be tevision. So they're dropping a syllable, okay? Those are all, it's a class of errors, totally normal, totally expected, and most kids do it. Another pattern, for example, would be something called final consonant deletion. When kids are learning to speak, they'll leave off the ends of words. So for example, pen might be pe, or bus might be buh. Totally normal. Your child might be able to make that S sound, but it's not about the sound, it's about the position of the word that it's in. Another very common one is something called cluster reduction. And a cluster is when there's two sounds together and they drop one of the sounds. So for example, school would be cool. Star would be tar. Sky would be kai. So totally developmental, typical, and until a certain age. And in the next slide, I'll show you the different ages, but a very as expected group of errors. So those are phonological processing patterns versus articulation errors. So an articulation error, it does not affect a whole group. It is a specific sound error. For example, your child might substitute W for R. It's a very common error. They might say like wed for red. They might say ya for la. So yayin for lion. Your child is substituting that ya sound for the L. They might, gosh, there's, say, food, they might say pood. Again, that's an error with the F sound. So, and kids can have both. They can have both phonological process errors as well as articulation errors. I hope that kind of explains the difference, and there's developmental norms for both, which we'll get into. So Hillary, if you want to slide me over. You're doing great, by the way. So here is the speech sound acquisition norms. So by age 3, we would expect a child to have all of these sounds that are listed below. I don't need to read them to you. By age 4, we would expect those. By age 5, and by age 6. To clarify, the TH voiced and voiceless, the voiceless is that TH as in the word thumb, or in bath, or math, or thank you. And the voiced TH, it's the same sound, but just with our voice on, would be them or bathe. So it's still that TH, but one is using our voice and one is not. So you can see right here, if someone were to call me and say, you know, my only concern is my child is having difficulty with the R sound and the child is 3, I'd say, okay, totally appropriate. Let's wait and see. Or if a 2-year-old is having difficulty with an S or a Z, or, you know, we'd say totally appropriate. Let's wait and see. It's not always a wait and see, because if you have, say, a 4-year-old, or I'm sorry, if you have a 3-year-old who's having trouble with every single 4-year-old sound, well, that's going to really impact their intelligibility. So while these charts are really important and we absolutely use them, there's also other factors, of course. Is the child frustrated? How many errors? What is the child's name? You know, if the child's name's Lily and they can't pronounce their L's, that might be frustrating for them. So there are other factors, but this is certainly a really great starting point for us professionals and parents as well. Do you want to slide me over? So here are the phonological process errors that I mentioned. So final consonant deletion, there's something called reduplication, which, you know, most children go through, you know, baba for bottle. Fronting, that's something when they take a back sound like t and g and make it in the front of their mouth. So it's t. So for example, car would be tar, go would be dough. Totally normal, typical error. And we would expect a child to outgrow it around age 3. So it's typical until age 3. And same with this stopping. I'm not going to get into, I don't need to read the detailed description, but basically it's when a child stops that forward airflow of a sound. So for example, like instead of like like jump, they would just do dump. So duh versus the yeah. So totally normal, just we would expect them to be resolved by age 3. Okay, you can. Okay, weak syllable deletion, that's the one that I mentioned, where tephone instead of telephone. Cluster reduction, that's the one I mentioned, poon instead of spoon. Assimilation, that's where one sound influences another sound. We often see it with the word dog is gog, or a lot of children will say yellow as lello. Totally appropriate, normal, typical, until about age 4, and then stopping for some of these later sounds. Okay. And then there are a few atypical errors. So an atypical error would be initial consonant deletion. So when they leave off the first sound, so the example I gave here was at for cat. This is never considered to be a developmental error, regardless of age. So it's usually symbolic of a more severe phonological process error. Backing. So I talked about fronting. Fronting is when we take those back sounds, the K and the G, the K and the G. If you do that sound, you can feel the back of your tongue lifting, and it's that's why it's called a back sound. And a T and the D is made with the tongue tip, so the front. So the fronting is typical, backing is atypical. That would be where we would take the T and D and turn those into a K and G. That is also never considered to be developmental. And when we add an extra consonant, also never considered to be atypical, never considered to be typical. These 3 errors right here are also kind of red flag errors for literacy concerns down the road. If we see these, we would want to monitor for any reading difficulties that the child might have. So you could see if a child has both final consonant deletion and initial consonant deletion, and they're trying to tell you the word cat, they're going to come to you and say, ah, and you're like, I have no idea what this child is saying. They're just saying, ah. They'll probably get diagnosed with a language delay, but that might not be the right diagnosis. They actually have the word cat. It's just being impacted by their speech delay because they're leaving off the first and the last sound, and then you're left with this ah. So it's really important to kind of tease out, because in this kiddo's mind, he or she is saying cat, like he knows that's the cat. This is what I'm saying. But it can really impact overall intelligibility, and that can lead to, frustration and all the things. Okay. Any questions about speech intelligibility, about the articulation versus phonological process? Nope. Okay. So this is a real, just kind of broad rule of thumb here. A 3-year-old should be, sorry, I'm realizing that my font was quite small. A 3-year-old should be about 24 to 48, about 25 to 50% intelligible at the single word level. And then the sentence level, about 12 to 41%. And then the numbers below 4, the numbers below 5. So you can see that all the way up to age 5, that we still expect that we don't expect a child to be 100% intelligible. What I always ask parents is, around age 4, if you were to invite someone over to your house that didn't know your child, or you met someone at the park, are you still serving as translator? Is that person kind of looking to you like, what did your child say? What did your child say? So if you're still, because as mom and dad and teachers, you guys know your kids, you can usually figure it out. You can, that's your job. But if someone were to come over, or maybe grandma, grandpa that, doesn't see them all the time, or, something like that. So that's a question that I'll often ask parents as well. Do you find yourself interpreting? And then when can we expect intelligibility to improve the fastest? We see the biggest jump in that 30 to 40 months time period, where we see the biggest leaps and bounds of intelligibility. Any questions, clarifications there? Okay. So, these might seem like common sense, but I think it bears repeating. This is what I do all day, every day, and yet I am guilty. Well, my daughter is going off to college, so hopefully I'm not doing, although I'm still doing these things. We all do them, but just something to think about as you're engaging with your children. What are considered conversation stoppers? This like testing your child, oh, what does the cow say? What does the horse say? I'm not saying never to do that. Of course, that's how they learn. But when it's kind of over and over, this just constant, asking yes or no questions, you're going to get a yes or no answer. So thinking about ways to ask those open-ended questions, or just commenting when you're playing with a child. So, I wonder if this bridge would fall down, versus like, do you think this bridge is going to fall down? You might get a yes, you might get a no. But if you say, wow, this bridge looks kind of wobbly, you're either going to get nothing, and that's okay. Maybe they just didn't want to respond, or you're going to get more than a yes or no. So commenting. The general rule of thumb with expanding what your child says is you double it. So if you have a single word speaker, or single words, they're just around 12 months, you give them back 2 words. So if they say ball, you can say, oh, big ball, or I don't know, cookie, or something like that. You could say like, wow, like, eating a cookie. So, and if they're using 2 words, you give back 4. If they're using 3, give back 6. It's not an exact science, but sometimes we give back, they say cookie, and you say, oh, you want to get a cookie? Should we walk over to the cabinet? I wonder what kind of cookie, and it's like, whoa. So really kind of being mindful of the language that we're modeling back. And silence is okay. I'm a talker, and when I first started working with little ones, I felt as though I couldn't be there in silence with them, especially with parents staring at me like, what are you doing? And I felt like I had to fill every second with something. But in actuality, that doesn't give the child an opportunity to speak. So just being okay with silence. So just some things to think about when you're playing with your children. Okay. Okay, I'm going to get into, there's a few questions about feeding. So I want to make sure that I spend a few minutes here. So picky eating problem feeders. We know that between the ages of about 22 months, roughly, for about 6 months, roughly, a child goes through kind of normal, what's called neophobia, like fearful of new food, picky eating. Okay, so most kids will go through this period of picky eating. So if I get a call from a parent and it's in this window, the follow-up questions that I'll have is the child just refusing that food, or are they melting down? Is the child, could you present that in a different way? Or what does it look like when the child is refusing that food? Can you wait a couple of weeks and then come back to it? So that's kind of that little window where I expect kids to get pickier, but I also right around like 28 months, certainly by 30 months, really expect them to have kind of grown out of that. So picky eaters, they eat about 30 or more foods. Problem feeders will have less than 20 consistent foods. Many of the kids that I work with have maybe 2 or 3 foods that they eat. Food loss due to burnout. So both kids might drop a food, but the difference being that picky eaters, after a break in that food, will usually come back to it, where problem feeders, they will start refusing a food and you are probably not going to get that food back in the mix. So it's a true food loss. Picky eaters, they can have different foods on their plate that they might not want. They might just eat around it, or maybe they'll push it to the side, or they might, maybe make a comment, but they're not going to become undone about it. A problem feeder will become undone most of the time. I have some kids that we're working on just being in the same room as certain foods, and we work toward just, getting that food in front of them. So I look at their reaction to new foods. Do the problem feeders, this one's not on here, but did your child inspect their foods? Will they look at it? And I'm not talking looking at it like we all look at our food before we eat it. I'm talking like, like examining it, kind of, wiping it off, really examining it. Does your child refuse entire categories of food? And by categories, I mean, fruits, vegetables, proteins, starches, or I might mean wet foods like yogurts and applesauces, or I might mean certain colors, like anything that's not a certain color or something like that. So will they refuse entire categories of foods? And then this one I know is a little bit tricky with toddlers and young kids, because sure, we might be cooking things a little bit different, but with a problem feeder, I'm not talking like, you're making like a chicken dish for yourself, and maybe for your toddler, you're maybe going to pull the chicken out, maybe not season it, you're going to make age appropriate modifications for your picky eater or your typical eater versus a problem feeder that you are consistently cooking something totally separate. And I don't mean because like you might just want to throw in nuggets that day and that is a-okay, but it's because that child, that's what they eat. A couple other things when I'm thinking about the consistent foods, for me, a consistent food is, can that child eat that food regardless of who makes it and regardless of where it is? So for example, if you were to say to me, oh yeah, my child eats at least 20 foods. And I said, okay, great. One of the foods is a quesadilla. So that tells me, that means if you make the quesadilla with yellow cheese, or if dad makes it with like yellow and orange cheese, or if you go to a restaurant and have it, or your child's going to eat that quesadilla regardless. And then the dad or mom will say, oh no, my child eats a quesadilla on this one specific tortilla, and it has to be with this one yellow cheese, and it has to be on the third Tuesday of the month when it's sunny. I mean, and there's all of these kind of caveat or asterisks with the food. That does not tell me that that child truly has that food mastered per se. They will eat that. Or kiddos who there's brand preferred and there's brand specific. So for example, graham crackers, I don't know, I might like the Nabisco graham crackers, but if I like graham crackers and you give me a graham cracker, I'm going to eat whatever brand, you're giving me. I might even be like, oh, I don't really like this one, but I'm still going to eat it because I like graham crackers. versus a problem feeder. It's like, oh no, it has to be this, this salt and vinegar chip, this brand, it's not just any salt and vinegar chip. So hopefully that is, that's, the 50,000 foot like separation or delineation between picky eater, problem feeder. The other thing that I failed to mention is this child's feeding impacting the family? I can't tell you how many parents come in and are in tears. The parents are fighting, mom's, dad's crying. It is stressful because as parents, we need to get our kids to eat and we do whatever means necessary. I get it. And if you're always thinking of, oh, Bobby, we're going to this party. Is there going to be food for Bobby? I should pack Bobby's food. What if he doesn't eat? What if, if your child, if you're putting that much thought and it is something you are thinking about, outside of the meals and already thinking ahead and maybe not going on vacation or that's not typical. That shouldn't be the case. So that would fall more in that problem feeder. So the impact that it has on the family, I think it's really important to consider. So hopefully that's enough information for those of you who asked. And again, always happy to point you in some direction, have a follow-up conversation, whatever that looks like. But any questions about picky eaters, problem feeders at this point? Yeah. Alessandra.
Yeah, I guess question. Our eater is less adventurous at home than she seems to be at daycare. I understand that's probably pretty common with peer pressure, but is there anything that we should watch out for around that or keep or mimic at home, short of bringing home more children to peer pressure?
Yeah, I see it go both ways. Some kids get to school and do not eat at all, so it goes that way. And some kids, see it on their friend's plate, or, I would say to, if anything, to, you could invite like one of, her, if you feel like she's actually not eating enough at home, then maybe have a couple separate plates with like some of her stuffies with a couple pieces of food on there. I really think that taking and I'm certainly not saying you're putting pressure on her at home, but trying to take some of that pressure of, take a bite, certainly not using food as a reward. If you finish this, you get this, giving choices, but maybe even just setting out a couple of other small plates with in front of you or just on the table that you can have as like family style, where you're all kind of choosing off of a plate, like picnic style. Like maybe you're having cut up cucumbers and they're sitting in the middle of the table where you all can access. Okay. Fluency, stuttering. What are some, and when I say stuttering, I shouldn't assume that everyone knows what I mean. So stuttering is a repetition or blockage of airflow when we're speaking. So for example, ball, cookie, or I want the ball, or a complete blockage of air, which would be I want the ball. So that's what I'm talking about. And I use the terms fluency and stuttering interchangeably. So these would be some kind of red flags or at risk if you're noticing any of these disfluencies or stuttered events in your child. So if there's any family history, specifically of fluency disorders, we know that there's a genetic predisposition to stuttering. We know that so a boy would be a red flag. Girls are much more likely to outgrow their stuttering. In fact, it's 3 to 4 boys continue to stutter for every 1 girl that does. If during these disfluent moments you're noticing any facial grimaces, body movements, eye blinks, change of pitch, so some kids will whisper, some we see really rapid eye blinks, so any what are called secondary behaviors. Frustration, if there's a traumatic event that happens and you notice stuttering occurs right after a traumatic event, and I say traumatic event, and I could also mean a big life event for the child. So it could even be another baby. So that shouldn't be traumatic, but that is a big life change for the child. And then when the child starts to stutter. So if they start to stutter before age 3, awesome. If they start to stutter before the age of 3.5, really good. After 3.5, that would be more of a red flag. So that's just kind of some overviews if we have any families out there whose kiddos might be stuttering. And then the next slide. This should have gone first, but about 5% of all children go through a period of stuttering that lasts 6 months or more, and a large population of them outgrow it. So most of the time, the kiddos do outgrow stuttering, and we expect it around that 2 to 3 year old, right during one of those language explosion time frames. Okay, so that's everything. If you want, you'll get this, but I would say the very best way to reach me, if there's follow-up questions, I'm going to talk about bilingual in 1 second, but here's my email, Jennifer@Katz Speech. I put our phone number down there. That's probably the absolute worst way to reach me. So, I mean, you can certainly call, but you probably won't reach me. And so email me with any questions. Always happy to be a resource, point you in, whatever direction, or just brainstorm with you as well. Okay, awesome. 12:50. I think, Hillary, if you want to maybe stop sharing. I don't think I have anything after. Yeah. And I want to go back to the bilingual language development as well. So there's different kinds of bilingual language development. So actually, let me just first preface it with saying this is not my area of expertise. I did anticipate this question, so I pulled some information. So what I'm sharing is factual, and I can point you to some additional resources, but I do just want to acknowledge that this is not my, I definitely don't consider myself an expert in bilingual language development. So there's 2 different types of bilingual language development. It is either the child is developing both languages together. So say English, and I think Dutch was the other language, or whatever other language. And then, or there's the child is monolingual in one language, and then they add a second language. So for the sake of this conversation, maybe I'll speak to bilingual where they're learning both together. Does that feel right, parents? I think Rowan mentioned that, and someone else.
Yes, for me at least.
Okay.
I hope so. I've been speaking Dutch since.
Great. So keep it up. There used to be the thought of one parent speaks one language, one parent speaks another language, or only speak one in one place, one at one at school, one at home. We now know that that is absolutely not the case anymore. So for kiddos who are learning both languages together, we might see around 18 months to about, I'm looking at my notes here, 18 months to about 24 months, we might see a language, something that might look like a language delay. But if we know that the child is being exposed to at least 2 languages, we would not consider it to be a language delay. They might present that way because they're not speaking, their vocabulary is going to be reduced and their length of utterance is going to be reduced. But we don't expect to see any differences with the receptive piece, the comprehension piece for typically developing children. We also know that even with atypically developing children, that we want to expose them to both languages. So we would expect to see code switching and errors with grammar for up to a year past the developmental norms of a monolingual speaker. So the verb plus ing, we would have that around age 2, 2.5, but for a bilingual language learner, we very well might still see errors with grammatical markers up to even 3.5. So a good year differential for any kind of grammar. And there are no contraindications. And in fact, everything shows the opposite, that being exposed to more than one language only enhances cognitive and executive functioning and literacy from a very early age. So hopefully that
Yeah, thank
answers.
you. That actually tracks exactly with my experience. My son is 16 months old, and he's starting to make some more sounds that sound like they might be words. He doesn't speak as much as I would have maybe expected for his age, but I do notice that he comprehends words in both languages, sometimes the same word, the same concepts in both languages separately, whether it's me or my wife. Like if we say eat in either language, he understands what that means. He makes the eating gesture and he walks to the kitchen and expects it.
Yeah. So yeah, for again, a typically developing child, that receptive language, we don't expect to see anything different than for monolingual versus bilingual. And it's really that, 18 months, that very early on, 18 months to, I forget what I said, about 24, 30 months, that there might be what appears to be an expressive language delay, but then we would expect the child to kind of pick up and go from there, maybe with the exception of some grammar that we would see later developing.
Jennifer, we also have 1 or 2 more questions in the chat from Louise about, she has a 1-year-old who feels that the transition to solids feel a little slow, and any extra tips on how to migrate off bottles and formula, or any additional feeding ideas as well.
Yeah. So tips to migrate off of bottles. I am a big fan of bottles should be gone at a year old. I know that might feel like, and I introduce straw cups around 9, 10 months. So really early on. For me, again, I'm coming at it from an oral motor perspective. Bottle is one type of sucking that our tongue is coming forward, and ultimately we don't want that. Straw is up and back. So I try to get that transition to straw cups pretty early. And there are some really great straw cups out there that for children who have a hard time, for many kids, you just put that straw up to their mouth and they just start sucking. But there are a lot of assisted straw cups that I would be happy to share with you, Louise, if you felt like your child was having a harder time kind of getting the concept of of the straw. Of the straw. So transition to feel slow. Tips.
I'm so sorry. Before you go on,
Yeah.
related to the tips, thank you for that. That's, I mean, I'm too late. Whoopsie daisies. But he's great with straw cups with water. But the formula in the straw cups, he just like almost regurgitates. He doesn't like that. Like, so like I feel like he has the skills. But I haven't figured out how to like sell him on that migration.
Yeah, you might not be able to. My gut for that is that the bottle is the routine, right?
Yeah.
You know, the bottle is his like sucking. We know that sucking can be calming. It's his routine, and he's like, wait a minute, that this isn't how it goes. So it might, in fact, it may or may not, depending on how old your kiddo is, and depending on, you know, if there's just formula in the bottle and maybe milk in the cup. I don't know if he sees them as interchangeable, or, you know, formula and milk. There might be that we would, with the straw cup, water down some of the formula or milk, and then slowly bring that up, and maybe in the bottle start to make the bottle less attractive and water that down a little bit. So we kind of play with that a little bit to make that transition. Happy to talk more about that if you wanted to reach out, but and also getting him, I don't know how old he is, but getting him excited about the straw cup. So smoothies, yummy, you know, fruit smoothies, or just getting him excited to use that cup.
Okay.
Water for a lot of kids is not that exciting.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. So we have 2 minutes. If there's any other questions, I'm happy to, or 1 minute, happy to answer. Otherwise, I really appreciate you inviting me today. I am a parking lot away, or a few parking spots away from some of you. Anything, don't hesitate to shoot me an email for whatever.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, for your time. Really appreciate all the thought and consideration from these topics. Also want to thank all the parents for being here, taking time out of your busy schedule. So we really appreciate that. We'll be sending out a recording for today's session. And also, if you have any additional questions, feel free to email to them. I can pass them along to Jennifer. And also, we'll be sending a short survey afterwards. So that can just give us like feedback and any thoughts or questions from there as well. So really, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Enjoy the rest of your week. And again, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks.